The autumn rain hammered Dodge City's wooden boardwalks like bullets from heaven, each drop carrying the weight of unspoken sins. Jack Mercer pulled his worn hat lower over weathered eyes as he guided his horse through the muddy streets. At 43, he'd seen enough sunsets to know when a town held secrets, and Dodge City reeked of them. The locals called him the Loner, though never to his face. Jack preferred it that way. 15 years of drifting from town to town had taught him that attachments meant pain, and pain was a luxury he couldn't afford. His saddlebags carried everything he owned, a change of clothes, ammunition, and memories he'd rather forget. Thunder cracked overhead as Jack approached the Dodge House Hotel, but something made him pause. Through the rain's symphony, he heard it, a sound that cut through his carefully constructed walls like a blade through paper. A child's sob, raw and desperate, echoing from the old wooden chapel at the end of Front Street. "Ain't none of your business, Jack," he muttered to himself, but his horse seemed to have other ideas, turning toward the chapel without command. The building stood like a forgotten prayer against the storm, its white paint peeling and cross-tilting slightly to the left. Warm light flickered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows on the muddy ground. The crying grew louder as Jack dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post with hands that trembled, not from cold, but from something deeper. The chapel door creaked open under his touch, revealing a scene that would haunt him forever. A boy, no more than 10 years old, knelt before the altar, his small frame shaking with each sob. Dirty blonde hair fell across his face, and his clothes, once fine, were torn and stained with mud and what looked like dried blood. "Hey there, son," Jack called softly, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "You all right?" The boy's head snapped up, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds, wide with terror and something else Jack recognized all too well, the look of someone who'd lost everything. In the child's trembling hands was a silver locket, its surface catching the candlelight. "Please don't hurt me," the boy whispered, scrambling backward until his back hit the altar. "I ain't done nothing wrong, mister. I swear it." Jack raised his hand slowly, the way he would approach a spooked horse. "Easy now. I ain't gonna hurt you. Name's Jack Mercer. What's yours?" The boy studied him with those haunting eyes, as if weighing whether to trust this stranger who'd emerged from the storm. "Eli," he finally whispered. "Eli Turner." "Well, Eli Turner, what brings you to this chapel on a night like this? Where's your family?" At the mention of family, Eli's face crumpled, and fresh tears carved clean tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. "They're gone," he choked out. "All of them. Ma, Pa, my little sister Sarah, they just vanished." Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach. In his years of wandering, he'd learned to read between the lines of human tragedy. "Vanished how, son?" Eli clutched the locket tighter. 3 days ago, I was out checking the rabbit snares behind our farm. When I came back," his voice broke. "The house was empty. No bodies, no blood, nothing. Like they just walked away and left everything behind. But they wouldn't leave me. They wouldn't." The conviction in the boy's voice made Jack's chest tighten. He'd heard similar stories before, families disappearing without a trace, usually when they'd seen or heard something they shouldn't have. In a town like Dodge, that could mean anything from cattle rustling to murder. "You been here 3 days?" Jack asked, settling onto a pew a safe distance away. Eli nodded. "Mrs. Dawes, she takes care of the chapel. She's been bringing me food, but she's scared. Says I need to leave town, that it ain't safe for me here." "Why would she say that?" "I don't know." Eli's voice cracked with frustration. "Nobody will tell me nothing. Sheriff Holden came by yesterday, said my family was probably killed by bandits and I should go to the orphanage in Wichita. But she's lying, mister. I can see it in her eyes." Jack leaned forward, studying the boy's face. There was intelligence there beneath the fear and grief. "What makes you think she's lying?" Eli opened the locket with shaking fingers, revealing a small photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a folded piece of paper. "My ma gave me this before whatever happened. She was scared, Mr. Mercer. Real scared. She made me promise to keep it safe and to trust no one if something happened to them." Can I see it? Eli hesitated, then slowly extended the locket. Jack took it carefully, noting the weight of good silver and the craftsmanship. The photograph showed a beautiful woman with Eli's eyes, but it was the paper that made Jack's blood run cold. Written in a woman's careful hand were the words, "The truth is in the old mine. Trust no one in town. Find the man with the scar on his left hand. He knows what they did. Keep Eli safe. M.T." "Your ma's initials?" Jack asked quietly. "Mary Turner," Eli confirmed. "What's it mean, Mr. Mercer? What truth? What mine?" Before Jack could answer, the chapel door burst open, and Sheriff Maria Holden stepped inside, rain dripping from her badge and her hand resting on her gun. She was a handsome woman in her 30s, with steel-gray eyes and the kind of presence that commanded respect. But Jack noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze darted between him and the boy. "Mercer," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Didn't expect to see you in a house of God." "Sheriff," Jack replied, standing slowly and palming the locket before she could see it. "Just taking shelter from the storm," her eyes fixed on Eli, who had shrunk back against the altar. "Boy, I told you yesterday, you can't stay here. It ain't proper and it ain't safe." "Safe from what?" Jack asked, noting how the sheriff's jaw tightened. "From the elements, from drifters, from all manner of dangers that plague a boy alone." Her words were smooth, practiced, but Jack heard the lie underneath. "I've arranged for him to go to Wichita tomorrow. There's a good orphanage there." "No!" Eli's voice echoed through the chapel. "I ain't going nowhere until I find out what happened to my family." Sheriff Holden's hand moved closer to her gun. "Boy, your family is dead, killed by bandits 3 nights ago. The sooner you accept that and move on, the better." "You're lying," Eli said, his young voice filled with surprising steel. "Just like everyone else in this town." The sheriff's face darkened. "Watch your tongue, boy, or what?" Jack interrupted, stepping between them. "You'll arrest a grieving child for speaking his mind?" Maria Holden's eyes met his, and Jack saw something there. Fear, desperation, and the weight of terrible knowledge. "This ain't your concern, Mercer. You'd do well to ride out of town come morning and forget you ever saw this boy." "And if I don't?" The sheriff's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then you might find Dodge City ain't as friendly to drifters as it used to be." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Jack felt the familiar itch between his shoulder blades that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. Whatever had happened to Eli's family, it went deep, deep enough that the law itself was compromised. "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff," Jack said carefully, "but I reckon I'll stay a few more days. See the sights." After Maria Holden left, her boots echoing ominously on the wooden steps, Jack turned back to Eli. The boy was watching him with a mixture of hope and fear that reminded Jack painfully of another child, long ago, a child he'd failed to save. "Mr. Mercer," Eli whispered, "are you going to leave me too?" The question hit Jack like a physical blow. He looked into those storm-gray eyes and saw his own past reflected there. The loneliness, the abandonment, the desperate need for someone, anyone, to care enough to stay. Against every instinct screaming at him to ride away, to avoid the pain that caring would bring, Jack Mercer made a promise that would change both their lives forever. "No, son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I ain't leaving you. Whatever happened to your family, we're going to find the truth. Together." Eli's face crumpled with relief, and he threw his small arms around Jack's waist. As the boy cried against his chest, Jack stared out at the storm-lashed town beyond the chapel windows, knowing he'd just signed his own death warrant. But for the first time in 15 years, Jack Mercer had something worth fighting for. The hunt for truth was about to begin. Dawn broke over Dodge City like a reluctant witness, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Jack Mercer hadn't slept, spending the night in the chapel's back pew while Eli finally found peace in exhausted slumber. The boy lay curled on a blanket Mrs. Dawes had provided, the silver locket clutched against his chest like a talisman. The chapel door opened with its familiar creak, and Agnes Dawes entered carrying a basket that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much sorrow. Her movements were careful, quiet, as if she feared waking more than just the sleeping boy. "Mr. Mercer," she whispered, approaching with obvious nervousness. "I heard what you told the boy last night, about staying, about helping him." Jack stood, working the kinks from his back. "Word travels fast in a small town." "Too fast," Agnes agreed, glancing toward the door. "And to the wrong ears. You don't understand what you're getting yourself into." "Then help me understand." Agnes set down the basket and wrung her hands. "The Turner family, they were good people, honest people. But honest people ask honest questions, and in Dodge City, that can be dangerous." "What kind of questions?" Before Agnes could answer, Eli stirred, his eyes opening to find Jack still there. The relief that flooded the boy's face was worth every risk Jack was taking. "You stayed?" Eli breathed. "Told you I would." Jack helped the boy sit up. "Mrs. Dawes brought breakfast." As they ate in the morning light filtering through stained glass, Agnes kept watch at the window. "There's been talk," she said quietly, "about strangers asking questions about you, Mr. Mercer. Men who don't look like they're from around here." Jack's hand instinctively moved to his gun. "What kind of men?" "The kind that work for Hank Brewster." The name hit Jack like a cold wind. Hank Brewster owned the largest ranch outside Dodge City, and his influence reached into every corner of the town's business. If Brewster was involved in the Turner family's disappearance, it meant the stakes were higher than Jack had imagined. "What's Brewster's connection to the Turners?" Jack asked. Agnes exchanged a meaningful look with Eli. "Tell him, boy. He needs to know what he's up against." Eli set down his bread, his young face grave. "My pa worked for Mr. Brewster sometimes, doing odd jobs around the ranch. But about a month ago, he came home real upset. Said he'd seen something he shouldn't have, something that made him sick to his stomach." "What did he see?" "He wouldn't tell me exactly, but I heard him talking to Ma late at night. Something about cattle that weren't cattle, and brands that had been changed. Pa said Mr. Brewster was stealing from other ranchers, changing their brands and selling the cattle as his own." Jack nodded grimly. Cattle rustling was a hanging offense in Kansas, and men had killed for less. "Your pa threatened to go to the law?" "That's just it," Eli said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Pa said the law was already bought and paid for. Said Sheriff Holden was in Brewster's pocket, along with half the town council." The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture that made Jack's blood run cold. If Thomas Turner had discovered Brewster's rustling operation and threatened to expose it, the rancher would have had motive to eliminate the entire family. But why leave Eli alive? "There's something else," Agnes said, her voice barely audible. "The night the Turners disappeared, I was here late, cleaning the chapel. I heard riders, lots of them, heading toward the Turner farm. When I looked out, I saw torches, maybe 8 or 10 men. You see who they were?" "Too dark, but I recognized one voice giving orders. Hank Brewster himself." Jack felt the familiar cold fury building in his chest. He'd seen too many innocent families destroyed by men like Brewster, men who believed their wealth and power put them above the law. But this time would be different. This time, he had a reason to fight back. "We need proof," Jack said. "Something concrete that ties Brewster to what happened." "The mine," Eli said suddenly. "Ma's note mentioned an old mine. Maybe that's where the proof is." Agnes paled. "The Silverton mine? Boy, that place has been abandoned for years. It's dangerous. Cave-ins, bad air, all manner of hazards." "Where is it?" "About 5 miles north of town, up in the hills. But Mr. Mercer, if Brewster's men are watching you, then we'll have to be careful." Jack turned to Eli. "You're staying here with Mrs. Dawes." "No!" Eli jumped to his feet. "I'm coming with you. It's my family, my fight." "It's too dangerous, son. And it's too dangerous for me to stay here," Eli countered with surprising wisdom. "If they want me dead, at least out there I can run. Here, I'm trapped." Jack studied the boy's determined face and saw himself at that age, stubborn, brave, and far too young to be facing such darkness. But Eli was right about one thing. Staying in town was just as dangerous as leaving it. "All right," Jack said finally. but you do exactly what I say when I say it. Understood?" Eli nodded eagerly, and Agnes pressed a small package into Jack's hands. "Food for the journey," she said. "And Mr. Mercer? Be careful. Hank Brewster didn't build his empire by being merciful to his enemies." An hour later, Jack and Eli rode north from Dodge City, taking back trails and avoiding the main roads. Jack had borrowed a gentle mare for Eli from the livery stable, paying extra for the owner's silence. The boy sat his horse well, and Jack found himself wondering what other skills Thomas Turner had taught his son. The countryside rolled away before them in waves of brown grass and scattered trees, beautiful in its harsh simplicity. But Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, watching for dust clouds that might signal pursuit. They'd been riding for 2 hours when Eli suddenly pulled up his horse. "Mr. Mercer, look!" In the distance, a thin column of smoke rose from a cluster of buildings that had once been the Turner farm. Jack's jaw tightened as they approached, seeing the blackened ruins of what had been a family's home and dreams. "They burned it," Eli whispered, his voice thick with pain. "They burned everything." The house was a skeleton of charred beams and ash, but the barn had been left standing, probably because it contained nothing incriminating. Jack dismounted and walked through the ruins, looking for any clue the fire might have missed. "Over here!" Eli called from near what had been the kitchen. "There's something in the well." Jack joined him, peering down into the stone-lined shaft. About 10 feet down, caught on a protruding stone, was a piece of cloth. Jack fashioned a rope from his lariat and lowered himself into the well, retrieving what turned out to be a woman's shawl, blue wool with delicate embroidery. "That's Ma's," Eli said, his voice breaking. "She was wearing it the last time I saw her." Jack examined the shawl carefully. It was torn, as if ripped away in a struggle, and there were dark stains that could have been blood. But more importantly, sewn into the lining was a small, hard object. "What is it?" Eli asked, as Jack carefully opened the seam. Inside was a brass key, old and tarnished, with numbers etched into its surface. 127, a safety deposit box key, Jack realized. Your ma hid evidence somewhere safe. The bank? Maybe. Or maybe... Jack studied the key more carefully, noting the distinctive markings. "This isn't from the Dodge City Bank. See these engravings? This is from the First National Bank of Wichita." Eli's eyes widened. Ma used to visit her sister in Wichita every few months. She always said it was just family visits, but maybe she was making deposits, Jack finished. "Smart woman, your mother. She knew if something happened, she needed evidence somewhere Brewster couldn't reach." A distant sound made them both freeze, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Jack grabbed Eli's arm and pulled him toward their horses. "How many?" Eli whispered. Jack listened to the rhythm of the horses. 4, maybe 5, and they're coming fast. They mounted quickly and rode hard for the cover of a nearby grove of cottonwoods. From their hiding place, they watched as 5 riders approached the burned farmhouse. Even at a distance, Jack recognized the lead rider's massive frame and distinctive black hat. Hank Brewster himself. The rancher dismounted and walked through the ruins with the casual air of a man inspecting his property. His men spread out, searching methodically, and Jack realized they were looking for the same thing he and Eli had found. "They know about the evidence," Jack whispered. "Question is, how much do they know?" One of Brewster's men called out, pointing toward the well. The rancher hurried over, and even from their hiding place, Jack could see his face darken with anger when he realized the well had been searched. Brewster shouted something to his men, and they mounted up, riding in a wide circle around the farm. They were looking for tracks, and it wouldn't take them long to find the trail leading toward the cottonwood grove. "Time to go," Jack said quietly. "And this time, we ride like our lives depend on it." Because as the dust cloud of Brewster's men grew closer, Jack realized their lives very well might. The race for truth had become a race for survival. The Silverton mine crouched in the hillside like a wounded animal, its entrance a black mouth that seemed to swallow light itself. Jack and Eli had ridden hard for 3 hours, using every trick Jack knew to throw off pursuit, doubling back through streams, riding over rocky ground that wouldn't hold tracks, and taking paths that would challenge even experienced trackers. Now, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the abandoned mining camp, Jack studied their destination with growing unease. The wooden structures around the mine entrance were weathered gray, some collapsed entirely. Rusted equipment lay scattered like bones, and the whole place carried the smell of decay and forgotten dreams. "Looks like nobody's been here in years," Eli observed, dismounting from his mare. "That's what worries me," Jack replied, his hand resting on his gun. "If your ma hid something here, she wasn't the only one who knew about this place." They approached the mine entrance cautiously. A faded sign warned of dangerous conditions, and Jack could see why. The wooden support beams were rotting and loose rocks had fallen from the ceiling. But there were also signs of recent activity, fresh horse tracks in the dirt, and a path through the debris that looked deliberately cleared. "Someone's been here recently," Jack said. "Question is, were they looking for the same thing we are?" Eli clutched his mother's locket. "Only one way to find out." Jack lit a lantern from his saddlebags and led the way into the mine. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, supported by increasingly unstable-looking timbers. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, and Jack found himself listening for any sound that might indicate they weren't alone. "Mr. Mercer," Eli whispered after they'd walked about 50 yards. "Look at this." The boy was pointing to marks carved into the tunnel wall, fresh scratches in the rock that formed letters. "MT plus ET safe." "Your ma was here," Jack said, "and she wanted you to know she made it this far." They continued deeper into the mine, following the main tunnel as it branched and twisted through the hillside. Jack's lantern cast dancing shadows on the walls, and more than once he thought he saw movement in the darkness ahead, only to discover it was just the play of light and shadow. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, they reached a wider chamber where the tunnel split in 3 directions. In the center of the chamber, someone had built a small cairn of stones, and tucked beneath it was a piece of paper wrapped in oiled cloth. Jack unfolded it carefully, recognizing the same handwriting from the locket. "My dearest Eli," he read aloud, "if you're reading this, then the worst has happened. I pray you found the key and that Mr. Mercer is with you. Yes, I know about the scarred man from town who helps people in trouble. Your father told me about him." Eli looked up at Jack in surprise. "She knew about you?" Jack frowned. He'd been careful to keep a low profile in Dodge City, but apparently not careful enough. "Keep listening," he said, continuing to read. "The evidence you need is hidden in the left tunnel about 100 paces in. Look for the support beam marked with our initials. But be careful. Brewster's men know about this place. They've been watching it. If they find you here—" The note ended abruptly, as if Mary Turner had been interrupted while writing. "She was scared," Eli said softly. "Really scared." Jack folded the note and tucked it into his shirt. "Come on, let's find what she hid." The left tunnel was narrower than the main passage, and Jack had to duck in several places to avoid low-hanging rocks. The air grew thicker as they went deeper, and he could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness ahead. After counting off 100 paces, he began examining the support beams more carefully. "There," Eli said, pointing to a beam about 10 feet ahead. "I can see something carved in the wood." Sure enough, the letters MT plus TT were carved into the rotting timber, along with a small arrow pointing downward. Jack knelt and began clearing away loose rocks and dirt from the base of the beam, and within minutes his fingers found something that didn't belong, a metal box wrapped in canvas and buried about 2 feet down. "This is it," he said, lifting the box carefully. It was heavy, about the size of a book, and secured with a small padlock. "Can you open it?" Jack examined the lock. It was good quality, but old, and the metal had been weakened by moisture. A few careful taps with the butt of his knife, and the lock gave way with a satisfying click. Inside the box were documents, lots of them. Bills of sale with altered dates, correspondence between Brewster and buyers in Kansas City, and most damning of all, a ledger in Thomas Turner's careful handwriting documenting every instance of cattle theft he'd witnessed over the past 6 months. "This is enough to hang Brewster," Jack said, flipping through the pages. "Your pa was thorough. Dates, times, descriptions of the stolen cattle, even sketches of the altered brands. But it was the last item in the box that made Jack's blood run cold. A letter addressed to Sheriff Maria Holden, signed by Hank Brewster, discussing payment for services rendered and mentioning the Turner problem specifically. "The sheriff really is working for him," Eli said, reading over Jack's shoulder. "Worse than that," Jack replied grimly. "This letter is dated 2 days before your family disappeared. They planned it, Eli. They planned the whole thing." A sound from the tunnel entrance made them both freeze. The echo of footsteps, multiple sets, moving with purpose through the mine. Jack quickly stuffed the documents back into the box and blew out the lantern. "How many?" Eli whispered. Jack listened carefully. "At least 4, maybe more. And they know where they're going." The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the glow of torches. Jack grabbed Eli's arm and pulled him deeper into the tunnel, looking for another way out. But this branch of the mine was a dead end. They were trapped. "Mr. Mercer," a voice called from the darkness behind them, echoing off the tunnel walls. "We know you're in there. Come out, and we'll make this quick." Jack recognized the voice. Deputy Frank Morrison, one of Sheriff Holden's men, which meant the law itself was hunting them. "What do we do?" Eli whispered. Jack studied their surroundings in the dim light filtering from the approaching torches. The tunnel ended in a wall of rock, but there was a narrow crack near the ceiling that might lead to another passage. It would be a tight squeeze, especially for a grown man, but it was their only chance. "Can you climb?" he whispered to Eli. The boy nodded, and Jack boosted him up toward the crack. Eli disappeared into the opening with the agility of youth, and Jack heard him whisper, "It goes through. There's another tunnel on the other side." Jack handed up the metal box, then began his own climb. The crack was barely wide enough for his shoulders, and sharp rocks tore at his clothes as he squeezed through. Behind him, the voices were getting closer. "They went down the left tunnel," someone said. "Morrison, you and Jake check it out. Rest of you, search the other passages." Jack dropped into the parallel tunnel just as torchlight began to flicker in the passage they'd abandoned. This new tunnel was even narrower, but it seemed to slope upward, hopefully toward another exit. They moved as quickly and quietly as possible, feeling their way through the darkness. Behind them, they could hear frustrated voices as Brewster's men discovered the empty hiding place and realized their quarry had escaped. "There's light ahead," Eli whispered after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Sure enough, a faint glow was visible in the distance. Not torchlight, but the pale illumination of daylight. They hurried toward it, emerging from a crack in the hillside about a quarter-mile from the main mine entrance. Below them, they could see horses tied near the mine, 5 of them, confirming Jack's count of their pursuers. But more importantly, they could see a way down the backside of the hill that would keep them hidden from the men searching the mine. "We need to get to Wichita," Jack said, as they made their way carefully down the slope. "That bank key your mother hid, whatever she deposited there might be the final piece of evidence we need." "What about our horses?" Jack looked back toward the mine entrance. Their mounts were hidden in a grove of trees about half a mile away, but retrieving them would mean risking capture. "We'll have to go on foot for now. Once we're clear of this area, we can find other transportation." They'd walked for about an hour when Eli suddenly grabbed Jack's arm. "Listen," he whispered. In the distance, they could hear the sound of many horses, more than the 5 that had been at the mine. A lot more. "Brewster called in reinforcements," Jack realized. He's not taking any chances. As if to confirm his fears, riders appeared on the ridge behind them, at least a dozen men, spread out in a search line. They'd been spotted. "Run," Jack said simply. They ran through the gathering dusk, 2 figures against an army carrying evidence that could destroy one of the most powerful men in Kansas. Behind them, the thunder of hoofbeats grew closer, and Jack knew that their race for justice had become a desperate flight for survival. But in his shirt pocket, the metal box pressed against his chest like a promise. Whatever happened next, they had the truth. Now they just had to live long enough to share it with the world. The final confrontation was coming, and Jack Mercer had never felt more ready for a fight. The abandoned farmhouse appeared in the twilight like a mirage of hope. Jack and Eli had been running for 2 hours, using every trick Jack knew to stay ahead of Brewster's hunting party. The old homestead sat in a depression between rolling hills, invisible from the main roads and surrounded by enough cover to hide an army. "We can't keep running forever," Eli panted as they took shelter in the farmhouse's root cellar. "They'll catch us eventually." Jack checked his ammunition. 12 bullets left against at least a dozen men. Not good odds, but he'd faced worse. "Maybe we don't have to run," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's time to make them come to us." "What do you mean?" Jack pulled out the metal box and opened it, studying the documents in the fading light. "Your parents were smart, Eli. They didn't just collect evidence. They made copies. Look at this." He showed Eli a letter at the bottom of the stack, written in Mary Turner's careful hand and addressed to the editor of the Dodge City Times. It detailed everything: Brewster's cattle-rustling operation, Sheriff Holden's corruption, and the threats against their family. "Ma was going to expose them," Eli breathed. "More than that," Jack said, examining the letter's date. "She mailed this 3 days before your family disappeared, which means someone in town already knows the truth," Eli finished. A sound from outside made them both freeze, the jingle of spurs on the farmhouse's front porch. Jack drew his gun and motioned for Eli to stay hidden as footsteps approached the cellar door. "Jack Mercer," a familiar voice called. "I know you're down there. We need to talk." Jack's eyes widened in surprise. It was Sheriff Maria Holden, but she was alone, and her voice carried none of the menace from their previous encounters. "Depends on what you want to talk about, Sheriff," Jack called back, keeping his gun ready. "About the truth, about what really happened to the Turner family, and about why I've been lying to everyone, including myself." Slowly, Jack climbed out of the cellar, his weapon trained on the sheriff. In the dim light, he could see that Maria Holden looked haggard, her usually pristine uniform wrinkled, and her face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like guilt. "Start talking," Jack said. Maria holstered her own gun in a gesture of good faith. "Hank Brewster has been blackmailing me for 2 years, she said quietly. "My brother got into gambling debts in Kansas City. Bad debts, to the kind of men who break legs first and ask questions later. Brewster paid them off, and in return, you looked the other way when his men rustled cattle. At first, it was just small things. Ignoring reports of missing livestock, delaying investigations. I told myself I was protecting my brother, that it wasn't really hurting anyone." Her voice broke. But then Thomas Turner started asking questions. Eli emerged from the cellar, his young face hard with anger. "So you let Brewster kill my family to keep your secret?" Maria's face crumpled. "No, I tried to warn them. I told Thomas to take his family and leave town, to forget what he'd seen. But he was too honest, too stubborn. He said he couldn't live with himself if he didn't expose the truth." "So what happened that night?" Jack demanded. "Brewster came to me, said he was going to handle the Turner problem permanently. I begged him not to hurt them, but he said it was too late. Thomas had already gathered too much evidence. I thought—" She took a shuddering breath. "I thought he was going to kill them all. But he didn't," Eli said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "He took them somewhere. They're still alive." Maria nodded. "I followed Brewster's men that night, stayed hidden and watched. They took your family to the old Brewster ranch house, the one he abandoned when he built his new place. I heard your father shouting, your mother crying, but I was too much of a coward to intervene." Jack felt a surge of hope mixed with fury. "They're being held prisoner? As far as I know, Brewster's been keeping them alive as insurance in case anyone came looking for evidence. If the truth came out, he could always produce the bodies and claim they were killed trying to escape. How do we know you're not lying?" Eli asked, his voice thick with emotion. How do we know this isn't another trap? Maria reached into her shirt and pulled out a folded newspaper, the Dodge City Times, dated 4 days ago. The headline read, "Local Family Exposes Cattle Rustling Conspiracy." "Your mother's letter was published," Maria said. "The whole town knows the truth now. Brewster's finished, but he's desperate. Desperate men do desperate things." Jack scanned the article quickly. It was all there. Names, dates, evidence. Mary Turner's final act of courage had exposed the corruption that had poisoned Dodge City for years. "Why are you helping us now?" Jack asked. "Because I'm tired of being a coward," Maria said simply, "and because those people don't deserve to die for my mistakes." A distant sound made them all turn. The thunder of approaching horses. Lots of them. But these weren't coming from the direction of Brewster's ranch. They were coming from town. "The cavalry?" Eli asked hopefully. Maria shook her head grimly. "Brewster's men. All of them. He's making his final play." Jack counted the dust clouds on the horizon. "How many men does he have? 20? Maybe 25. All armed, all loyal to him because he pays better than honest work." The odds were impossible, but Jack had made a promise to a frightened boy in a chapel, and he intended to keep it. "Where's this old ranch house?" "About 5 miles north of here in Devil's Canyon. It's a fortress, high walls, only one way in or out." "Then that's where we're going." "Jack," Maria said urgently, "you can't fight 25 men. It's suicide." "Maybe," Jack agreed, "but I've got something they don't." "What's that?" Jack looked at Eli, seeing the determination in the boy's eyes that reminded him so much of Thomas Turner. "I've got the truth, and sometimes that's the most powerful weapon of all." As Brewster's riders drew closer, Jack outlined his plan. It was desperate, dangerous, and depended on perfect timing. But it was their only chance to save the Turner family and bring justice to Dodge City. An hour later, as the sun set behind Devil's Canyon, 3 unlikely allies rode toward their final confrontation with Hank Brewster. Behind them, the lights of Dodge City twinkled in the distance. A town waiting to see if justice would finally prevail. The old Brewster ranch house sat like a fortress in the canyon, its walls high and forbidding. But Jack could see lights in the windows and smoke rising from the chimney. Someone was definitely inside. "There," Maria whispered, pointing to a small building behind the main house. "That's where he'd keep prisoners. It used to be the bunkhouse." Jack studied the layout carefully. The plan was simple in concept, but deadly in execution. Maria would approach openly, claiming to have captured Jack and Eli. Once inside, she would free the Turner family, while Jack created a distraction that would draw Brewster's men away from the prisoners. "Remember," Jack told Eli as they prepared to separate, "no matter what happens, you get your family out of there. Don't look back, don't try to help me, just run." "What about you?" Jack smiled, the expression grim but determined. "I'll be fine, son. I've got a few tricks left." As Maria rode toward the ranch house with her prisoners, Jack circled around to the back of the canyon. The metal box with its precious evidence was hidden in his saddlebags, insurance that even if they didn't all survive, the truth would still come to light. The sound of Maria's voice carried across the canyon as she called out to the guards. "Open up! I've got Mercer and the boy!" Jack waited until he heard the gates open, then lit the fuse on the dynamite he'd taken from the abandoned mine. The explosion that followed lit up the night sky and sent Brewster's men running toward the sound, just as planned. In the chaos that followed, Jack saw Maria emerge from the bunkhouse with 3 figures: a man, a woman, and a small girl. The Turner family, alive and safe. But Hank Brewster himself appeared in the doorway of the main house, a rifle in his hands and murder in his eyes. He raised the weapon toward the fleeing family, and Jack knew there was only one way to stop him. The gunfight that followed was brief but decisive. When the smoke cleared, Hank Brewster lay dead in the dirt, and justice had finally come to Devil's Canyon. 3 months later, Jack Mercer sat on the porch of the rebuilt Turner farm, watching Eli teach his little sister Sarah how to rope a fence post. Thomas and Mary Turner had recovered from their ordeal, and the family was stronger than ever. The corruption in Dodge City had been exposed and cleaned out. Sheriff Maria Holden had resigned and left town, seeking redemption elsewhere. And Jack had discovered something he'd thought lost forever: the meaning of family and the joy of having somewhere to belong. "You staying for supper?" Eli called out, his voice bright with happiness. Jack smiled, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on his face. "Wouldn't miss it, son. Wouldn't miss it for the world." The lonely cowboy had found his home at last. "Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.